This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. In the summer of 1815, Europe was a continent with a problem. Emperor Napoleon of France had just been overthrown for the second time, ending decades of chaos. But while peace had returned, an uneasy question lingered: what to do with the defeated emperor? Since 1803, the Napoleonic Wars had killed between 3.2 and 6.5 million people. Already exiled once, Napoleon had simply returned like some sort of 19th century Ernest Blofeld. But with Europe's big bad now captured, the Allies had to decide. Do they kill Napoleon and risk martyring him, or imprison him again and risk a second comeback? Their solution was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than put Napoleon in an ordinary jail, they would construct a super prison, one even the petty corporal couldn't escape. The name of that prison? Well, that was Longwood. A former summer residence on St. Helena, Longwood was remote, isolated, and surrounded by gun turrets, cliffs, and crashing waves. Converted to a jail by the British, it became the only place on Earth capable of holding the emperor. But what made Longwood so special, and how did Napoleon come to end his life there? Well, today we're investigating the final home of the man who brought Europe to its knees. Out in the wilds of the Atlantic Ocean, over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest major landmass, sits an insignificant little speck. Seen from above, this speck looks like nothing more than a mistake, an accidental twitch of a cartographer's pen. Even up close, it retains that air of unbelievability. Unbelievable that anyone could live here. But make no mistake, this island of barren mountains and sheer cliff faces, this hostile lump of rock surrounded by swirling currents, is inhabited, all right. In this, the year of our Lord 1815, it counts among its number 4,000 civilians and 1,000 slaves. To that total, it's about to add one defeated emperor. Discovered in 1502 by the Portuguese, the island of St. Helena had briefly passed to the Dutch before being taken by the East India Company. Although today associated with the British Crown, the East India Company really was a company, a private corporation that conquered lands and annexed swaths of India. They were also good at getting others to do their dirty work. When they needed occupants for St. Helena, they settled it with the Londoners who'd lost everything in the Great Fire. It was on this strange remote island that Longwood would come to be built. Although Longwood today is famous as Napoleon's prison, it wasn't originally intended to house dictators. Constructed in 1743, it was first used as a storage barn before becoming a summer residence for St. Helena's lieutenant governor. But while summer residence may sound fancy, it was only fancy if your last abode was now charred London rubble. 8 kilometers from the island's sole port, Longwood was on a vast desolate plain, battered by howling winds and infested with rats. Were anyone to be held captive there, they would almost certainly be seen trying to flee. And even if they did make it to the island's edge, the sheer cliffs and churning water would make escape impossible. So yes, Longwood may not have been constructed as a jail per se, but it certainly had all the makings of one. Hence the letter St. Helena's governor received in the fall of 1815. At that time, getting to the island was so difficult that news arrived years late, when it arrived at all. The last anyone there had heard, Napoleon had just been defeated and exiled to Elba. So imagine their surprise when the letter writer told them that Napoleon had not only escaped Elba, restarted the French Empire, and then been defeated all over again, but that now he was on his way to St. Helena. The moment they heard the news, the islanders must have suppressed an internal shudder. Somewhere out there on the dark waves, a tyrant was approaching, a man who'd once had the whole of Europe beaten and cowed at his feet. What would happen when he finally arrived in his new prison? Well, no one could say. At this stage, you may be wondering how Napoleon went from Emperor of the French to dude getting imprisoned in the middle of the Atlantic. Well, if that thought has crossed your mind, just know that you are absolutely watching the right channel. Napoleon had come to power in 1799 with the coup of 18 Brumaire, which isn't the French way of saying November, but one of the wacky months the French revolutionaries invented for their new calendar. Not that there were many revolutionaries left by the time of the coup with the silly name. In 1795, the Directory had come to to power and replaced revolutionary fervor with dull authoritarianism. It was these amateur despots Napoleon had overthrown, eventually making himself emperor in 1804. From that point on, Europe had become his personal whipping boy. At its height, the Napoleonic Empire and its client states ruled over 70 million people. Even nominally independent empires like Austria had been forced to do Napoleon's bidding. Because if you didn't obey, then Boney was only too happy to hand your ass to you on the battlefield. From 1799 to 1809, Europe's states had assembled their own Avengers teams, known as the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th coalitions, only to have French Thanos beat them every time. It got so bad that by 1812, everyone was pretty much certain that Napoleon had won. He had the entire continent locked into his boycott of Great Britain, and nobody so much as sneezed without handing over a pile of francs. And then the emperor had gone and made the classic European dictator mistake. It invaded Russia. You probably already know what a total disaster that became. Turns out Russia is pretty darn cold, and when the Russians have burned all shelter and destroyed all food in the places you've just conquered, that can become a bit of a problem. As Napoleon retreated towards Paris, his men died in droves. Russian irregulars harassed their lines, killing even more. Although exact numbers are hard to come by, it's thought that Napoleon took over 680,000 troops into the snow and ice of the East. When he returned west, only 27,000 remained. For the rest of Europe, this was pretty much just like, well, party time. In the spring of 1813, the 6th Coalition formed, and they wouldn't rest until Napoleon's empire was finished. The climactic battle had come in mid-October. Starting on the 16th, 370,000 Allied troops faced off for 3 days against a rebuilt French army of 198,000 at the Battle of Leipzig. It was the biggest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, an apocalyptic clash that shook Europe. When the dust settled, Napoleon had suffered the greatest defeat of his career. Although Napoleon fought on for nearly 6 more months, the writing was on the wall. By March 1814, the 6th Coalition was marching on Paris. As the emperor fled the capital, citizens took one look at the incoming armies and declared, to hell with this. In a special session, the government announced that Napoleon had been deposed. When the news reached the emperor, he tried to abdicate in favor of his son Napoleon II, but everyone was pretty much like, no. On April the 6th, 1814, Emperor Napoleon abdicated unconditionally. Finally, the upheaval that had started with the 1789 French Revolution was over. Now the victorious allies just needed to figure out what the heck they were going to do with this former emperor. For a guy who'd just killed several million Europeans in a vicious war, Napoleon sure wasn't treated like a pariah. The Treaty of Fontainebleau that set out the terms for his defeat was less a punishment and more an epic consolation prize. Although his family were forced to surrender their claim to the French throne, he was allowed to keep the title of emperor and awarded an annual salary of 2 million francs. On top of that, the allies essentially gifted him Elba, basically saying, sorry about your lost empire, but here's an island to make up for it. Today, we talk about Napoleon's exile on Elba like it was some sort of punishment. But, I mean, have you seen Elba? Covering 200 square kilometers and home to 12,000 people, Elba in 1814 was warm, beautiful, and seriously relaxing. And Boney wasn't even a prisoner. No, he was Elba's new ruler with all the rights of any monarchy. So essentially, Napoleon tried to conquer the world, and everyone's like, yeah, just have a small kingdom. Whenever I've tried to conquer the world, there have been consequences. It wasn't like the Allies weren't aware of how ridiculous this was, but they were exhausted by 15 years of fighting France. They'd won the war in part by assuring the French that they weren't going to exact revenge. Part of that deal was to let the dictator who'd started it all live out the rest of his life in peace. On May the 3rd, 1814, Napoleon arrived on Elba. He brought with him the remnants of his court and 700 loyal guards. Although he publicly declared, I want to live from now on like a justice of the peace, in private he told his friends that a restored Bourbon monarchy wouldn't last 6 months. And so Elba adjusted to life under its new ruler. As the European powers gathered to hammer out a post-Napoleon future, Napoleon busied himself overhauling Elba, refining its education system, building roads, draining its marshes. But if anyone expected the emperor to be content on his island, they were doomed to disappointment. The problem started before the year was out. By late 1814, it was clear that restored Louis XVIII had no intention of paying Napoleon his 2 million francs a year. On top of that, the great powers were openly discussing sending the petit corporal further away, putting more distance between him and Europe. Realizing his time on Elba was running short, Napoleon decided to act first. On March 1st, 1815, he landed a ship in France and began marching towards Paris, gathering an army as he went. It was the start of the 100 Days, a time when the French Empire rose from its ashes to fight again. But, as the name suggests, it didn't fight very long. Within 5 days of Napoleon's return, Austria, Britain, Prussia, and Russia had formed the Seventh Coalition. When Napoleon finally met them in battle on June the 18th, it wasn't as a great returning general, but as a disappointing tribute act, a performer who doesn't know when to leave the stage. The Battle of Waterloo ended with Napoleon's final defeat. Although the Emperor fled the battlefield hoping to catch a boat to America, the jig was up. On July the 15th, Napoleon surrendered to the British, likely to avoid capture and execution by the Prussians. Still unwilling to martyr the Emperor, the Brits were left with no choice but to exile him all over again. But this time, it wouldn't be to some comfy, sun-drenched island a mere 10 kilometers from the European mainland. No, this time the petty corporal was going to find himself sent to the most secure prison the world had ever seen. But before we get into that part of the video, let me tell you about today's fantastic sponsor, Squarespace. Now, two simple things. Maybe you've got some idea for a website or a business that you want to start, or maybe it's something like a YouTube channel like this or a podcast, something like this. I mean, with the YouTube one, you obviously make the channel on YouTube, but you're going to want to have a companion website. Well, the second thing is the only way to find out whether that's worth doing is to get it out into the world. And that can be a bit daunting because it's scary to go and pursue new things, but not knowing how to set up a website isn't an excuse. And the good news is there are no excuses available with Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to create a powerful website for whatever you're up to. You want to sell something online? Yes, easily set up a store with Squarespace. You want to start a podcast? Well, they handle that too. Now, it all starts on Squarespace with a beautiful template that you can customize to your heart's content. Or, if you're feeling brave and you've got design skills, you can start from scratch. But, if I were you, just use one of their amazing templates. Or, if you've already got a website, just move it over to Squarespace, where it'll be easier to manage. Now, once you've gone through the super easy customization process, there are no updates, no patches, no website BS to deal with. And Squarespace also handles all of the website-y stuff, mailing lists, social integrations, and a whole lot more. Like I say, Squarespace removes the excuses to your dreams. Just go get started right now. Also, 24/7 customer support, just in case you get stuck. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And let's get back to the video. Until the airport opened in 2017, the only way to get to St. Helena from Europe involved flying to South Africa, then jumping on a ferry and sailing for 5 days. So you can imagine how long the journey took over 200 years ago. Napoleon left Plymouth for his second exile on August the 8th, 1815. He didn't set eyes on St. Helena until October the 14th. After seeing the rock he was doomed to spend the rest of his life on, Napoleon is said to have muttered, "It seems no charming place to live in. I should have done better to stay in Egypt," a reference to his 1798 campaign. "I should now have been emperor of the whole Orient." The boat landed the next day, although Napoleon refused to disembark until the 17th, and only then under the cover of darkness. As the 5,000 inhabitants of St. Helena watched in solemn silence, the man who'd once made Europe tremble departed the boat and began his new life as a British prisoner. However, his sentence didn't start at Longwood. Because news of Napoleon's arrival had only reached the island days ahead of Napoleon himself, there had been almost no time for preparations. So, Napoleon had to spend the first 2 months at cozy Briar's Pavilion. The house was owned by the Balcombe family, and while they were so stoutly British they probably bled tea, they were also extremely gracious hosts. In fact, their 13-year-old daughter Betsy managed to befriend the emperor, playing blind man's buff with him and teasing him for his inability to sing. It's said that Napoleon later regarded his short stay with the Balcombes as the high point of his second exile. Shortly after getting settled in at Briar's, Napoleon was taken to inspect Longwood. Although his reaction was one of intense disappointment, don't kid yourself into thinking that it was anything like a regular prison. Longwood had a private lounge, a decorated bedroom, antique furniture, or a study where Napoleon could write his memoirs. It was so cushy it would have made even a Norwegian jail look like a Texas prison. Yet, for a man who'd once lived in France's finest palaces, it looked like nothing but an insult. Work continued on Longwood until December, while Napoleon cooled his heels with the Balkans. Finally, shortly before Christmas 1815, the Emperor moved into his final prison. Once there, the British made every effort to keep him happy. Napoleon was allowed to run Longwood like a private court. At dinner each day, he made the male guests wear military uniforms, and the female guests came wearing gems. During the daytime, he worked alternately on his memoirs and on a vast plan to turn the desolate plain around the house into a sculpted garden. The British even gave him the run of the island. Napoleon was allowed to go to any point on St. Helena, even riding a horse, so long as he took a British valet with him. All in all, then, Napoleon's first months at Longwood were far from miserable. Even though he might have chafed under the rules, he was still living a more comfortable life than almost any other prisoner on Earth. But Napoleon's comfort, it was not destined to last. Already the British had dispatched a new man to act as the Emperor's jailer, and Governor Hudson Lowe was going to make it his mission to make Napoleon as uncomfortable as possible. In Napoleon literature, Hudson Lowe has a pretty dismal reputation, often seen as less of a governor and more as a petty tyrant. For an actual tyrant like Napoleon, Lowe's reign must have been infuriating. The interactions between the two were frosty from the get-go. When Governor Lowe arrived in April 1816, he refused to call Napoleon emperor, instead referring to him as general. We know, what a bastard. But Lowe did more than just insult the emperor's dignity. During his tenure, Lowe ended Napoleon's freedom of movement. He forced the emperor to present himself in the flesh each day to prove that he hadn't escaped. Lowe also banished the Balkan family from the island, sending Betsy back to England for getting too friendly with the emperor. For the already gloomy Napoleon, this was a crushing blow. Deprived of possibly the one person within 2,000 kilometers who actually liked him, Napoleon retreated from life, shutting himself up inside Longwood and refusing to go out. He had peepholes cut in the wooden shutters so he could spy on the outside world, and settled into a kind of listless slump like a teenager having an extended sulk. Locked away in his comfy prison, the one-time ruler of Europe lost his extraordinary edge. He became just another man, almost boring in his simplicity. The routine that eventually came to characterize Longwood began with Napoleon rising late and breakfasting at 10. After that, he sometimes practiced his English, sometimes worked on his memoirs, sometimes even spread campaign maps out on his desk and relived his glory days, pushing little toy soldiers around. Then it was dinner at 7, followed by reading, then a game of cards, and then bed at midnight. The only time this routine was disturbed was when Boney went out to work on his garden, a pastime that included digging secret sunken pathways so he could move about without the British seeing him. This wasn't for any practical purpose, you understand, it was just so that he could feel like he was winning at something. By now, it was becoming clear just how hellish Longwood really could be. The rat infestation was out of control, with vermin crawling over every surface. One evening at dinner, Napoleon picked up his hat to put it on, only to have a rat leap out and scuttle down his coat. After that, a good half hour's rat catching was added to the daily evening schedule. The weather, too, was becoming a trial, with water seeping through the roof, leaving everything damp and miserable. Mold claimed clothing, termites chewed on the walls. On bad days, mist swirled around outside, infused with a cold which seemed to seep inside your bones and poison you from the inside. And speaking of poison, almost everything in Longwood was doused in arsenic. Not as part of a clever British assassination plot, but just that's because what stuff was made out of in the 19th century. Trapped inside his damp, poisonous jail, the general who'd once taken everything Europe could throw at him stopped exercising and slowly got fat and listless. But if you're tempted to think of Napoleon as a tragic figure and Hudson Lowe as a bad guy, don't be. Although he's often cast as the villain in these pieces, Governor Lowe was a remarkable man. In 1818, for example, he unilaterally freed every child slave on St. Helena 15 years before the British Parliament outlawed slavery in the colonies. Napoleon, on the other hand, in his early days as ruler of France, had fought a war with the former colony of Haiti to put all of its freed slaves back in chains. He may have been a great man of history, but up close, Napoleon was less great than he was just another despot. The last years of Napoleon's life were taken up with absurd escape plots. There's a good chance these plots were never serious and only spread by Napoleon as a way to make Governor Low freak out. That would certainly explain their general wackiness, such as smuggling Napoleon back to France on a homemade submarine. But even if they were serious, Napoleon would have never got very far. St. Helena was surrounded by a cordon of British guard ships, all just waiting for an escape attempt. The Navy had also garrisoned the neighbouring island of Tristan da Cunha, 2,400 kilometres away, just in case Napoleon might make an attempt to use it. No matter how hard he tried, the Emperor was going to be stuck in jail until the very end. When that end finally came, it was drawn out and miserable. Napoleon had been ill since 1817 and had repeatedly accused Governor Low of poisoning him. In reality, though, he'd developed both a stomach ulcer and likely gastric cancer. All through his harsh winters and lonely summers on St. Helena, the diseases ate away at his insides, leaving only a rotten shell. Napoleon began to complain of pain, of night sweats that left him drenched, of blurred vision and headaches. As 1821 dawned, the illness became so bad that Napoleon wrote into his will that "My death is premature. I have been assassinated by the English oligopoly and their hired murderer." That first sentence was at least right. On May 4th, 1821, Napoleon lost consciousness at Longwood for the final time. Although he never woke up, he did manage to slur out a few last words. "My God," he said, "the French nation, my son, head of the army." Napoleon Bonaparte died in his luxurious, depressing prison on May 5th, aged only 51. Shortly after, Governor Low had him buried in a grave 3 meters deep and lined with bricks. Even in death, it seems the British didn't want to give the petty corporal an easy escape. In the wake of its prisoner's death, Longwood was sold to a farmer who converted it into a barn. Within a handful of years, Napoleon's former bedroom was home to a flock of sheep, while chickens clucked and left droppings all over his one-time study. After holding history's most notorious prisoner for over half a decade, it seemed Longwood was already doomed to be forgotten. Luckily, though, fate intervened. In 1848, a revolution in Paris deposed the French monarchy for the final time. The very same year, the nation's first free elections returned an outsider populist with famous family connections as president. His name was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, but you likely know him as Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon himself. Like his uncle before him, Napoleon III quickly launched a coup and had himself made emperor. Then, once his position was secure, he set about protecting his uncle's legacy. In 1854, the British were contacted by French representatives who wanted to buy Longwood, then little more than just a collapsed shack. Since this was in the middle of the Crimean War and France and Britain were fighting as allies, London said yes. 4 years later, the British handed over both Longwood and Napoleon's former grave to France for the sum of £7,100. Although Napoleon III would himself be deposed in 1870, the new French Republic never thought about washing its hands of Longwood. The building remains a French possession, even now. Looking at Longwood from the outside today, you'd never think that it had once been a prison, that it once held the world's most dangerous man. Yet, in the end, Longwood House achieved its goal. Napoleon never escaped its brightly decorated walls, never again set foot on European soil. Although it was a mere footnote at the end of a great life, the tale of Longwood deserves to be more widely known. Here, the man who helped forge the modern world ended his life in bitterness and luxury, as alone and as isolated as a character from Shakespeare. If that isn't an ending that deserves to be remembered, then what is? And I really hope you did find that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and do check out our fantastic sponsor, Squarespace. They're linked to below. And thank you for watching.